My name is Margaret Hollis. If you're just starting to listen to this story now, I want you to take a deep breath, maybe sit down if you're standing, because what I'm about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen in my own family, to my own granddaughter, right under all of our noses. I'm 68 years old. I've lived through a lot in my life. I raised 3 boys mostly on my own after my husband passed when they were young. I worked 2 jobs, put them all through college, and watched them become good men. My middle son, Brian, he became a nurse at Mercy General Hospital here in Columbus, Ohio. I was so proud of him. Still am, actually, despite everything that happened. Brian married Jessica 5 years ago. She seemed perfect for him. Beautiful, charming, always smiling. She worked part-time as a receptionist at a dental office, and she was pregnant with Sophie when they got married. I'll be honest with you. I had some reservations at first. Something about Jessica felt off to me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. You know how sometimes you just get a feeling about someone? But I kept my mouth shut. I'd seen too many mothers-in-law ruin relationships with their sons by being overbearing, and I wasn't going to be that woman. Sophie was born in March of 2018, and she became the light of my life. I lived just 15 minutes away from Brian and Jessica's house on Maple Drive, and I used to visit 2 or 3 times a week. Brian worked night shifts at the hospital, usually from 7 in the evening until 7 in the morning, so Jessica was alone with Sophie most nights. I'd come by during the day sometimes to help out, bring groceries, play with Sophie in the backyard. Everything seemed fine. Normal. Jessica was a decent mother from what I could see. She kept the house clean. Sophie was always dressed nicely, and they seemed happy enough. But looking back now, I realize I was only seeing what Jessica wanted me to see. The first time I noticed something was wrong was last October 14th, to be exact. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I'd stopped by unannounced around 4 o'clock. I had picked up some fresh apples from the farmer's market and wanted to make my famous apple pie with Sophie. When Jessica opened the door, I immediately noticed Sophie standing behind her mother's legs, which was unusual. Sophie normally ran right to me, arms wide open, yelling, "Grandma!" loud enough for the neighbors to hear. But that day, she just stood there, quiet. Her eyes looked different, not sparkly like usual, kind of vacant, almost. "Hey there, sweet pea," I said, kneeling down. "Want to help Grandma make a pie?" Sophie looked up at Jessica before answering. Actually looked up at her mother for permission to speak. That struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. "She's tired today," Jessica said quickly, that perfect smile plastered on her face. "We had a busy morning at the park. Maybe another time, Margaret." I noticed Sophie was wearing a long-sleeved shirt even though it was still pretty warm outside, probably 75 degrees. Jessica saw me looking. "She's fighting a little cold," Jessica explained before I could ask. Didn't want her to get a chill. I left that day feeling unsettled, but I couldn't articulate why. It was just a grandmother's intuition, I suppose. Something felt off. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more things. Little things that individually meant nothing, but together painted a disturbing picture. Sophie had become withdrawn. When I'd visit, she barely spoke unless Jessica prompted her. She'd developed this habit of flinching whenever Jessica moved suddenly, even if it was just to reach for something. Dark circles had appeared under her eyes, making her look so much older than 7 years old. I mentioned it to Brian one Sunday in mid-November when he stopped by my house for coffee. It was one of his rare days off, and Jessica had taken Sophie shopping, or so he said. "Brian, honey, have you noticed anything different about Sophie lately?" I asked carefully. He looked tired. The night shifts were wearing on him, I could tell. "Different how, Mom?" "She seems, I don't know, quieter, more withdrawn, and she's got these dark circles under her eyes like she's not sleeping well." Brian sighed and rubbed his face. "Yeah, I've noticed she's been having some trouble sleeping. Jessica mentioned it. They think it might be nightmares or something. Growing pains, you know. The pediatrician said it's probably a phase." "And what about the flinching?" "She jumps at every little sound." "Kids go through phases, Mom," he said, but I could hear a hint of defensiveness in his voice. "Jessica's doing a great job with her. She's very attentive." I wanted to push harder, but I didn't. I should have. God, I should have. Thanksgiving came and went. We all gathered at my house, the whole family. Sophie barely ate anything at dinner. just pushed her mashed potatoes around on her plate. When I asked if she was okay, Jessica answered for her. "She had a big breakfast, didn't you, sweetie?" Jessica's hand rested on Sophie's shoulder, and I saw my granddaughter tense up at her mother's touch. That night, after everyone left and I was cleaning up, I couldn't shake the image of Sophie's face from my mind. The way she'd looked at her plate instead of at any of us. The way she'd asked to be excused in almost a whisper. The way she'd walked out of the room with her shoulders hunched like she was trying to make herself smaller. I started visiting more frequently after that. Always unannounced. Jessica didn't like it, I could tell. Her smile got tighter each time I showed up, but she couldn't really refuse me without seeming rude. I was Sophie's grandmother, after all. On December 3rd, I arrived around 3:30 in the afternoon. Jessica answered the door in yoga pants and a tank top, looking annoyed. "Margaret, we've talked about calling first," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I know, dear, I'm sorry. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd pop in to see my grandbaby. Where is she?" "Taking a nap." "At 3:30 in the afternoon? Is she sick?" "She's fine. Just tired." "Can I peek in on her?" I saw something flash across Jessica's face. Panic, maybe? Fear? It was gone so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. "She really needs her rest, Margaret. She's been very cranky lately when she doesn't get enough sleep." I left, but I sat in my car at the end of the block for a while, just thinking, a 7-year-old taking a 3:30 afternoon nap on a Tuesday? It didn't add up. That evening, I called Brian at the hospital during his break. "Honey, does Sophie usually nap in the late afternoon?" "What?" "No, Mom. She hasn't napped during the day in years." "Why?" "Jessica said she was napping when I stopped by today around 3:30. There was a pause. "That's weird. Maybe she wasn't feeling well?" "Maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it. The real turning point came on December 18th. I had gone to Target to buy some Christmas presents, and as I was walking through the children's clothing section, I saw them, Jessica and Sophie. Jessica hadn't seen me yet. She was gripping Sophie's wrist tightly, too tightly, while hissing something in her ear. Sophie's face was scrunched up like she was trying not to cry. I quickly ducked behind a rack of clothes and watched. Jessica jerked Sophie's arm, and my granddaughter stumbled. Then Jessica leaned down, her face inches from Sophie's, and said something that made the child go completely still and pale. My heart was pounding. I wanted to march over there, but something stopped me. Some instinct told me that confronting Jessica in public would only make things worse for Sophie later. So I watched as Jessica straightened up, smoothed her hair, and plastered that perfect smile back on her face before leading Sophie toward the checkout. I stood there shaking for a full 5 minutes after they left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Sophie's terrified face, the way she'd gone pale and still, the grip Jessica had on her wrist. At 2 a.m, I got out of bed and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't go to Brian. He was so exhausted from his work schedule, and he clearly didn't want to believe anything was wrong. He'd just tell me I was overreacting, being an overbearing mother-in-law. I could call Child Protective Services, but what would I tell them? That my daughter-in-law grabbed her daughter's wrist too hard in Target? That my granddaughter seemed withdrawn? They'd need more than that. I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. The next morning, I drove to Best Buy and bought a Nest camera. The young man at the counter explained how it worked, how it connected to Wi-Fi and recorded to the cloud. I bought 2, actually. They cost me $148 after tax, but I didn't care. Now I just had to figure out how to install them in Brian and Jessica's house without anyone knowing. I got my chance on December 20th. Brian called me in the morning, sounding stressed. "Mom, I hate to ask, but could you watch Sophie tonight? Jessica's office is having their Christmas party and I'm pulling a double shift at the hospital. We'd have to cancel, but she's been looking forward to it." "Of course, honey. I'd love to. You're a lifesaver. Can Sophie sleep over at your place? I'll pick her up in the morning before I head home." "Absolutely." Jessica dropped Sophie off at my house at 5:30. My granddaughter had a small overnight bag and looked exhausted. "Be good for Grandma," Jessica said, kissing the top of Sophie's head. To me, she added, "Thanks so much for doing this, Margaret. I really appreciate it." "Happy to help. You have fun at your party." As soon as Jessica's car pulled away, I knelt down in front of Sophie, "How are you doing, sweet pea?" She shrugged. Wouldn't look at me. "Are you hungry?" "I made spaghetti. Your favorite." Another shrug. During dinner, I tried to engage her in conversation, but she gave one-word answers. When she reached for her water glass, her sleeve rode up, and I saw them. Bruises, finger-shaped bruises circling her upper arm. My blood ran cold. "Sophie, honey, what happened to your arm?" She immediately pulled her sleeve down and looked scared. "I fell." "You fell? When?" "At school. On the playground." But her eyes darted away when she said it. She was lying. A 7-year-old child was lying to protect her mother. "Does it hurt?" She shook her head quickly. Too quickly. I didn't push. Not then. Instead, I told her we could watch a Christmas movie and have hot chocolate. We watched Elf, and slowly, very slowly, Sophie started to relax. By the time the movie ended, she was actually smiling a little. When I tucked her into the guest bed that night, she looked up at me with those big brown eyes. "Grandma?" "Yes, baby? Can I stay here forever?" My heart broke into a million pieces. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" But she just turned over and pulled the blanket up to her chin. "Nothing. Good night, Grandma." I kissed her forehead and whispered, "I love you so much, Sophie. So much." I stayed awake all night, planning. At 7 in the morning, I woke Sophie and made her pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse, the way I used to when she was littler. She ate 3 of them, which was more than I'd seen her eat in months. Brian picked her up at 8:30. He looked exhausted but happy. "Thanks again, Mom. You're the best." "Anytime, honey. Anytime." After they left, I sat in my living room and cried. Then I dried my tears, picked up my purse, and drove to Brian's house. I had the spare key he'd given me for emergencies, and this qualified as an emergency in my book. I let myself in and stood in the entryway, listening. The house was silent. Jessica's car was gone from the driveway, so I knew she was at work. I had maybe 2 hours before she'd be home. I installed the first camera in Sophie's bedroom, tucking it on top of her bookshelf behind a stuffed unicorn, angled to cover most of the room. The second one I put in the hallway outside her door, on a high shelf, disguised behind a decorative vase. The young man at Best Buy had explained that these cameras had motion detection and night vision, and everything would record automatically to my phone. I tested them both, made sure they were working, then left. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the lock. That night, I downloaded the Nest app and watched the live feed nervously. Jessica had come home around 5:30. Sophie was in her room, playing quietly with some dolls. Everything looked normal. At 7:30, Brian left for his night shift. I watched him kiss Jessica goodbye, ruffle Sophie's hair, and head out the door. And then everything changed. Within 5 minutes of Brian leaving, Jessica's entire demeanor shifted. The smile vanished. She marched into Sophie's room without knocking. I turned up the volume on my phone and listened. "Did you tell your grandmother anything?" Jessica demanded. Sophie looked up, confused. "About what, Mommy?" "Don't play dumb with me. She's been coming around a lot lately, asking questions. What did you tell her?" "Nothing." "I didn't say anything, I promise." Jessica grabbed Sophie's arm, the same arm with the bruises, and yanked her to her feet. Even through my phone's small speaker, I could hear my granddaughter cry out in pain. "You better not have," Jessica hissed. "Remember what I told you? About what happens to little girls who tell lies about their mommies?" Sophie was crying now. "I remember. I didn't say anything. I promise, Mommy." Jessica released her with a shove, and Sophie stumbled backward, hitting the edge of her bed. "Get ready for bed. Now." I sat there on my couch, my whole body trembling, watching my daughter-in-law storm out of the room. Sophie stood there crying silently for a few moments before starting to change into her pajamas. This was just the beginning. What I would witness over the next 2 weeks would haunt me for the rest of my life. Every night after Brian left for work, the abuse would start. Sometimes Jessica would come in and yell at Sophie for something minor, like leaving a crayon on the floor or not putting her shoes away perfectly. Sometimes she'd grab Sophie's arm and squeeze until the child was whimpering. Sometimes she'd make Sophie stand in the corner for hours. But the worst night was January 2nd. Brian was working another double shift. He'd called me earlier in the day, mentioning he probably wouldn't be home until late morning the next day. Jessica knew she had all night. At 9 o'clock, I watched through my phone as Jessica entered Sophie's room. Sophie was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. "I know you're awake," Jessica said coldly. Sophie's eyes opened. "Get up." My granddaughter slowly got out of bed, standing there in her frozen pajamas, her little body trembling. "Your teacher called me today. She said you've been having trouble paying attention in class, staring off into space, not doing your work." "I'm sorry, Mommy. I'll try harder." "You're embarrassing me. Do you know that? Making people think I'm a bad mother because you can't follow simple instructions." "I'm sorry." Sorry isn't good enough. What happened next? I can't describe in detail without getting sick. Jessica made Sophie stand in the corner of her room with her arms raised above her head. Every time Sophie lowered her arms because they got tired, Jessica would slap the back of her legs. This went on for over an hour. I watched it all on my phone, tears streaming down my face, my finger hovering over the call button to dial 911. But I couldn't just call the police. I needed to be strategic about this. If I called right then, it would be my word against Jessica's. She could claim the camera was illegally installed. She could say I was a bitter mother-in-law trying to destroy her marriage to my son. I needed more. I needed a pattern. I needed documentation that no lawyer could explain away. So I watched. And I recorded. Every single night. January 3rd. Jessica screamed at Sophie for 15 minutes because she'd spilled juice on the kitchen counter. January 4th. Jessica locked Sophie in her room without dinner. January 5th. Jessica twisted Sophie's ear until she cried, all because the child had asked if she could have a friend over to play. By January 6th, I had 8 nights of footage. 8 nights of documented abuse, complete with timestamps and audio. I had built a case that no one could deny, but I still hadn't acted because I was terrified. What if I made things worse? What if CPS investigated but didn't find enough to remove Sophie, and then Jessica found out I was the one who reported her? What would she do to Sophie then? I was a 68-year-old woman, alone, trying to figure out how to save my granddaughter from her own mother. The weight of it was crushing. The decision was made for me on January 7th. I had gone to bed early that night, exhausted from stress and lack of sleep. But my phone buzzed around 11:30 with a motion alert from Sophie's camera. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the feed. Jessica was in Sophie's room, and she was angrier than I'd ever seen her. She had Sophie by both arms, shaking her, screaming that she was a worthless, stupid child who ruins everything. Then Jessica slapped her. Not a light slap. A full-force strike across Sophie's face that knocked my granddaughter to the floor. I was on my feet and moving before I even realized what I was doing. I grabbed my purse and car keys and was out the door in 30 seconds. I drove the 15 minutes to their house in about 8 minutes, probably breaking every traffic law in Columbus. I used my key to let myself in quietly. I could hear Jessica upstairs, still yelling. I pulled out my phone, started a voice recording app, and slowly climbed the stairs. "You're going to tell your father you fell," Jessica was saying. "If you tell him I hit you, you know what will happen. I'll send you away, far away, to a place where children who lie about their mothers go. You'll never see Daddy or Grandma again." "I won't tell," Sophie whimpered. "I promise." I reached the doorway and looked in. Sophie was on the floor, holding her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Jessica was standing over her. "You better not." That's when I stepped into the room. "Get away from her." Jessica spun around, her face going white. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" I said, "Get away from my granddaughter. This is my house. You can't just barge in here. I have video of everything you've done to that child. Everything. For the past 2 weeks, I've watched you abuse her every single night. I have hours of footage, Jessica. Hours." I watched her face go from white to red. "You've been spying on me? That's illegal." "Maybe. But what you've been doing to Sophie? That's definitely illegal. Now you have 2 choices. You can sit down on that bed and wait quietly while I call the police. Or you can try to leave, and I'll call them anyway and press charges for child abuse and attempted flight." Sophie had scrambled to her feet and run to me, wrapping her arms around my waist. I could feel her whole body shaking. "It's okay, baby," I whispered. "Grandma's here. You're safe now." Jessica looked like she wanted to run. I could see her eyes darting toward the door. But then she seemed to realize how bad that would look and slowly sank onto Sophie's bed. "You can't prove anything," she said, but her voice wavered. "I can prove everything." I called 911 first. Then, while we waited for the police, I called Brian at the hospital. "Mom? What's wrong?" "It's almost midnight." "Honey, I need you to come home. Right now." "What?" "I'm in the middle of a shift. I can't just—" "Brian." My voice broke. "I'm at your house with Sophie and Jessica. The police are on their way. I have evidence that Jessica has been abusing Sophie. I've been documenting it for 2 weeks." There was a long silence. Then, "What?" "I'll explain everything when you get here. But your daughter needs you. Right now." He showed up before the police did, still in his scrubs, looking completely lost. When he saw Sophie's face, swollen and red from where Jessica had struck her, he literally staggered backward. "Jessica, did you do that?" She started crying. Actual tears. "It's not what it looks like, Brian. Your mother has been harassing me, installing cameras in our house without permission, making up lies." "I have video," I said quietly. 2 weeks' worth. "I'll show you. But maybe not in front of Sophie." My sister Clara, who I'd called while waiting for everyone to arrive, pulled up just as 2 police officers were walking up the driveway. She took Sophie out to her car while I showed the officers the footage on my phone. They watched in silence, their faces getting grimmer with each video. Jessica was arrested that night. They took her out in handcuffs while Brian stood in the living room looking like his entire world had collapsed. Which, I suppose it had. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked after she was gone. "Would you have believed me?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. God help me. I don't know." The next few weeks were a blur. Jessica was charged with multiple counts of child abuse. CPS opened an investigation. Brian had to take a leave of absence from work to deal with everything. Sophie came to stay with me while it all got sorted out. Her pediatrician documented 12 separate injuries in various stages of healing. Bruises, marks, even a small burn on her shoulder from where Jessica had grabbed her while cooking. Jessica's lawyer tried to claim I had violated wiretapping laws by recording without consent. But the prosecutor argued that I had probable cause to believe a child was being abused and that my actions had saved Sophie from continuing harm. The judge agreed. What we discovered during the investigation made everything even worse. Jessica's own mother had called me at one point. She lived in Florida and hadn't seen Jessica in years. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Jessica had a daughter before Sophie. From a previous relationship, the father got full custody when the girl was 3 because there were issues. I tried to warn Brian before they got married, but Jessica said I was lying. I'm so sorry." So this wasn't the first time. Jessica had abused before and gotten away with it by cutting off everyone who knew the truth. The trial was in April. Brian filed for divorce and sole custody simultaneously. I testified, showing the footage in court. Sophie had to speak to a child psychologist, but didn't have to testify, thank God. Jessica pleaded guilty to avoid a longer sentence. She got 6 years in prison and permanent loss of parental rights. Her lawyer tried to get probation, but the judge said the premeditated nature of the abuse, the way she'd isolated Sophie and threatened her into silence, showed she was a danger to children. And yes, they looked into whether anyone else knew. Turns out Jessica's best friend, Amber, had witnessed Jessica grab Sophie roughly once and did nothing. She was charged with failure to report child abuse and got probation plus community service. Sophie is 11 now. She lives with Brian, who switched to day shifts so he could be home every night. She's in therapy twice a week. It's been almost 4 years, and she's slowly becoming a normal, happy kid again. She laughs now. She has friends. She doesn't flinch when someone raises their hand anymore. Brian and I have a better relationship than we ever did. He apologized for not listening to me, for dismissing my concerns. I told him it wasn't his fault, that Jessica was very good at hiding what she was doing. I still have nightmares sometimes about those 2 weeks of watching the abuse and not being able to stop it immediately. I wake up in a cold sweat, wondering if I should have acted sooner. But my lawyer told me that if I had, Jessica might have gotten away with it. The pattern of abuse I documented was what convinced the court that this wasn't just discipline or a one-time mistake. It was deliberate, calculated, ongoing abuse. I'm sharing this story because I want people to know something important. If you suspect a child is being abused, trust your instincts. Yes, gather evidence if you can. Yes, be strategic. But don't wait forever. The warning signs I missed at first? Dark circles under the eyes, withdrawal from normal activities, flinching at sudden movements, wearing long sleeves in warm weather, not wanting to go home, asking if they can stay somewhere else forever. If you see these signs in a child, please say something. Call Child Protective Services at 1-8004-ACHILD. You can report anonymously. You might save a life. Sophie told me something last year that I'll never forget. We were baking cookies together in my kitchen, and out of nowhere, she said, "Grandma, you saved me." I had tears in my eyes. "You saved yourself, sweet pea. You survived. But you believed me, even when I couldn't tell you. You knew something was wrong and you didn't give up." That's what I want to leave you with. Sometimes children can't tell you what's happening to them. They're too scared, too confused, or too controlled. But they'll show you if you're paying attention. Be the person who pays attention. Be the person who acts. Be the person who saves them.